too. So welcome, everybody. I think we are officially recording now. So everything you say can and will be used against you in future embarrassing moments when it comes to the world of budgeting. So that is the world of technology that we're in. But welcome, everybody. We're really excited to continue sort of this back channel that AABPA was founded on. So let me just take a quick second. I'm assuming most of you know about AABPA since you're here, but just in case you haven't, one of the reasons I am feel so privileged to be part of this organization, and I think I counted at least 6 past AABPA presidents on this call. So apparently we're doing something right that we all keep showing up into this particular space. Is this was really designed to be a back channel organization, to be that group of sitting around a table, chatting with what people are thinking. I know I see some of you who were also on a call yesterday with a similar organization talking about the future of performance. One of the things I'm a firm believer of is that it takes folks coming together to think and work through ideas. And that's really what this hour is designed for. It's entitled the Monthly Musings, to really throw out some ideas, some concepts, to hear something new that maybe you haven't heard before, and to share some information that, who knows, 5 or 6 years from now might change the way A11 Part 6 is maybe rewritten, not rewritten, exists or doesn't exist. We could talk about that a little bit if you'd all like. So lots of things to sort of cover off. The way we're going to run today is I'm going to turn it first to Seema and then to Christopher. They're going to give you a little bit of their background, kind of some of their current musings and thinkings. I'm going to facilitate a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn it to the group. So you're probably all familiar now with all the great features of Zoom. We've got a chat button, so if something moves you and you want me to bring it up, feel free to put it in the chat. I facilitate Hollywood Squares all the time with my role on the Chesapeake Bay Committee and Council of Government. So if you want recognized, there's a hand raise, there's a wave your hands, there's a whatever we need. So I'll try and get to you if you have a question. But with that, as we have done in the past, I'm going to turn it to Seema first and kind of give her you the opportunity to introduce kind of yourself, a little bit of the background, and kind of kick us off on your musing for the moment here. And then we'll kind of build to Christopher and go from there. Any questions about the ground rules or kind of where we're at from an organizational standpoint? If not, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and nice to be with everybody today. I'm actually going to just introduce myself and then have Chris start with his musings, because he's going to give a statewide perspective first, and then I'll bring you down to a city like Baltimore, tell you a little bit about that and things that we've been doing here. But I oversee a project at the University of Baltimore called the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And we have been collecting city, state, and federal data for the last 20 years on behalf of any stakeholder that's interested in neighborhoods, which is pretty much everybody. But it's for elected officials, it's for city agencies, it's for communities, and for advocates in their own neighborhoods. So understanding how capital investments have been occurring or not occurring in some of our neighborhoods is all part of looking at equitable distribution of resources for our neighborhoods. So I'll tell you a little bit about that after Chris is done.
Sure. Thanks, Seema. And thank you, Karen, and everyone for inviting me today. It's great to be with you. My name is Chris Meyer. I'm a research analyst at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that works on state fiscal policy, so budget policy, tax policy, as well as a few other items like labor policy, working to build broadly shared prosperity in Maryland. And so equity-based fiscal analysis is one of the things that we have really increased our focus on over the past few years. I was putting together a presentation, but I don't have a full slide deck for you now, so I might wind up doing a little bit of screen share. Excuse me just a second. So I think it's worthwhile to start by thinking about first, why should we do equity analysis, and what does that mean, and how can we do it effectively? So starting off with why. Ultimately, the purpose of any public policy is to improve society in one way or another. And it's important to make sure that those policy outcomes are, distributed equitably across different groups of people, and to make sure that, we're actually enacting policy effectively in the context of pre-existing societal inequity. So then how you actually define equity, I think that there are a number of different definitions that you can use. One of the most basic kind of operational definitions that can help in analysis is simply saying, some outcome is equitable if it can't be predicted on the basis of any particular group identity. So it's useful to think about equity across multiple dimensions, both individually and in intersection with one another. So there's been a lot of discussion, appropriately so, about racial equity. Then we also can think about gender equity, disability equity, income or wealth equity, and thinking about those individually as well as in combination with one another. And just an example of that would be, for example, because income is one of the major channels for racial inequities, it can be very easy to just talk about racial inequity exclusively in terms of income. But we know in Maryland, for example, that Black families with relatively high incomes are actually likely to live in lower income neighborhoods with higher poverty levels compared to white families with somewhat lower income levels. So that would be an example of why it's important to look across multiple dimensions simultaneously. So some of the three main kind of branches of equity analysis that we've been working on is we have a series of long form reports called Budgeting for Opportunity. We've so far released 2 iterations of that, the first of which looked at our state health budget, education, and transportation, and the second of which looked at criminal justice. And then the second component is we have been working with lawmakers to incorporate equity analysis into the routine legislative analysis of any bills that come before the General Assembly. So currently, the Department of Legislative Services in Maryland does fiscal analysis of every bill, expenditure impacts, revenue impacts, and then it also includes discussion of impacts on local governments and impacts on small businesses. And so why does the legislative analysis include a discussion of impacts on small businesses? Well, policymakers decided that that is an important population for them to know about policy impacts on in order to achieve the outcomes they care about. And so we believe that equity analysis is also an important way to make sure policymakers are fully informed of the impacts of their policy choices. So as we think about how to do equity analysis effectively, there are a number of considerations. I already talked about the importance of disaggregating to the extent possible by multiple dimensions simultaneously. So race and ethnicity, gender, income, and obviously there's a trade-off there because the smaller intersections of multiple variables you're looking at, often you're looking at smaller populations or smaller sample sizes depending on what data set you're working with. And so there's a trade-off there. And often, when there are data limitations, it can be better to acknowledge those explicitly rather than simply leaving out some analysis. So for example, we know that Indigenous residents of Maryland have a number of social, economic, health outcomes that reflect barriers they face economically and in society generally. But often we just don't have enough data to show that with any kind of reliability. You'll have a margin of error on some statistic that's as large as the estimate itself. So in that case, instead of simply glossing over, it can be important to say there's likely something important here, but we just don't have the data to show it. Another important principle for equity analysis, in our view, is that it has to begin with an analysis of what the pre-existing inequity in society is. I think that when we think of equity analysis, the first thing that comes to mind up front is just disaggregating data, which is really important. That is the first thing you need to start with. But if you are just simply disaggregating, obviously, depending on your position, if you're a legislative or executive branch analyst, this will look different from if you're an advocate. But if you're making policy recommendations, for example, what kinds of disparities should you be concerned about versus which ones should be less concerning, has to be based in an analysis of what power disparities actually exist in society, as well as what are the causal mechanisms driving those disparities. So as far as the role of causal mechanisms, obviously, if you want some policy choice to, reduce inequity or lead to a more just society, then you have to make sure that you're actually addressing the roots of what that inequity is. So something that is very well known is racial and ethnic, as well as economic disparities in educational outcomes. And so there are kind of two major causal explanations that have been proposed. One that floats around a lot is the so-called 2 million words hypothesis, that often children of color or children from low socioeconomic backgrounds are hearing fewer words from their parents in childhood. That's based on a few studies, and there's been a lot of critique of whether that's actually accurate. Another causal explanation that has been advanced a lot and has a lot of evidence behind it relates to so-called toxic stress, actual physiologically measurable impacts of high levels of anxiety and stress from day to day, which then have an impact on learning later in life. So having an understanding of those causal mechanisms obviously affects what sorts of policy choices will meaningfully impact the actual outcomes. Something that people often can find surprising when they look at our equity analyses, especially our Budgeting for Opportunity series, which is about the state budget, is there's a lot of discussion of human outcomes and relatively little discussion of actual dollars and cents in the budget. And one of the main reasons for that is it's simply important to actually have the context of how dollars and cents relate to outcomes. So for example, I'm not very good at screen sharing here. I'm not going to try it right now. But if you look at public school funding, for example, and you look at funding for various school districts by their racial and ethnic composition, you might notice, oh, okay, a school district with a high level of students of color, a high level of low income students actually seems to have more funding per pupil than a relatively wealthier district. So is that indicative of a really highly equitable distribution, or is that in fact an inequity because, well, why doesn't the wealthier district have more funding? And so, looking at the actual outcomes and seeing, okay, based on these causal mechanisms, we know that students of color and students in low-income families face these barriers and then tend to have lower outcomes, makes you understand, okay, so having this district have more funding might make sense, and in fact might actually be inadequate relative to the disparity in needs. Um, I think the final thing in terms of principles in equity analysis that I find very important in my master's program in public administration, my budgeting class, we had one of the drier sections was on budgeting theories. And so the professor started out by introducing us to VOK's famous, depending on who you're talking to, question, on what basis shall we allocate X dollars to activity A versus activity B? And we really think that is often not the most important question. The fact is that at least we in Maryland and in a lot of other states are simultaneously underinvesting across a wide range of policy domains. We've got hundreds of thousands of people who don't have health insurance or are seeing bad health outcomes. We've got schools that are underfunded relative to even outdated funding standards. We've got a large number of people facing unaffordable housing or food insecurity. And so if you're just looking at, okay, how are we slicing up this pie, that can be a relatively ineffective way to look at it. So we're an independent nonprofit and we work on tax policy. So depending on your position, this can look different for you, but we will often look at trends in funding or staffing in comparison to needs without so much looking at how is the pie sliced, because the fact is, often the overall size of the pie can matter more than simply how it's sliced up. Then I guess I would say one additional thing, if you're actually working in putting together equity analysis at a public agency as part of the routine part of policy making, it's really important to have specific, consistent measures that are used for that analysis. Just like any other kind of performance measure, having those specific measures makes sure that you're actually getting an informative analysis rather than cherry pick data that doesn't necessarily tell you much. And with that, I'll hand it off to Seema, who can tell you more about sort of what that looks like in practice in Baltimore.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate that. And Seema, as you get ready to come in, I just want to commend this entire group in particular, you both, for being here. The conversation about equity is an important one. It is an uncomfortable one. It is one that we have to become more used to doing. And so I want to applaud us for taking this on. And Seema, as I hand it to you, I have to share this with you all. We in the city of Fairfax are embarking on an effort to make a more equitable future for our city. And last night in council comments, I was able to channel a little bit of what I felt from the inauguration. And when I think about Amanda Gore and what she did for all of us last Wednesday, I can't help but remember the line that I said yesterday, that being American is more than the pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. And Chris, a lot of what you just talked about there is the past that we've inherited. I, as a council member, did not know until I read Color of Law that you could not get a mortgage in some of our neighborhoods if you weren't white. I didn't know that, right? I'm very comfortable admitting I didn't know that. Now that I know that, I have to share that. Being silent is being complicit in this discussion. And Christopher, you're giving us the opportunity to step into that world and to stop being silent, to recognize that when we sit at the table, it is a table that is already set up with inequities. So I think I really appreciate the way you've teed up this conversation about how to be thoughtful and why this should be part of it and in that discussion. I recognize that those words may be uncomfortable for some folks. Before coming into this opportunity to facilitate this, I made sure that I was comfortable being uncomfortable. And so that's part of what we're asking everyone to do today, and I applaud that. So Seema, I look forward to hearing a little bit more about how you're applying that kind of in practice in Baltimore.
Unmute myself. Yeah, thank you for those words. I think that's really important for you to say. And also, Christopher did an excellent job of kind of explaining the difficulty, even if we do good math, right? And even if we put out good stats, a lot of us are looking at this for the first time. And the question is, what are you going to do with this information? What is equity? And really struggling to define that collectively. So hopefully this is useful information to you, as we think about how to do that. So just to give you a brief overview of who we are and kind of bring you into Baltimore, for those of you that may not be familiar with the city. Our organization is what's called a data intermediary. We have been a part of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnerships, where some of your cities might have a partner that's very similar to ours. And we are a learning group trying to bring best practices of data and metrics and indicators for communities and broad stakeholders. Our signature product, if you know nothing else about us, if you come to our website, you're going to see the vital signs report for the city of Baltimore. It's annual data for every one of our neighborhoods across these 8 topics. There's over 110 indicators, and all of our communities essentially get their vital signs report. Like when you go to the doctor's office and you get your battery of tests, every neighborhood every year learns about their crime rate, or how many kids in their neighborhood goes to school, or how many jobs there are, and what their median sales price is. That's what we do every year. And because of that, we have an excellent, it's like having a stethoscope on every one of our neighborhoods all the time. We can see things that are fluctuating, see things that are changing, and see how impacts and interventions that might be occurring through policy changes or budgetary changes are impacting our cities. Impacting our neighborhoods. And so we did work with the city planning department on the CIP analysis for looking at how equitably distributed is capital investment in the city. And for those that may not know or are looking for ways to explain equity planning, I recommend kind of the grandfather of equity or advocacy planning. That's Norman Krumholtz. He was at Cornell. He just passed away last year. But there is actually a new book, and I think it's downloadable for free in electronic form, called Advancing Equity Planning Now. And it's a series of case studies from around the country on cities wrestling with how to deal with equity. So it could be useful reading for the group. But what I love about the way that Norman Krumholtz frames it is that equity planning is a way of addressing poverty and racial segregation, but it's not about the outcome. The outcome is what you see. It's about the process, right? So just as the council person said, the outcome is that we have these segregated neighborhoods with disparity in terms of mortgages, but the result, the process and decision-making happened almost a century ago. And so really looking at how your decision-making process might lead to inequitable outcomes is what advocacy planning is all about. And that you're in it for the long term. This is not going to be an easy or quick conversation. It's not going to change overnight. And so you have to build it into your existing processes. So what we did was look at other cities that have done equity indicators to look at, we're a majority minority city, right? Almost 70% of our population is is African American. So if we just looked at race as an equity indicator, we're talking about the vast majority of the city. So you have to dig a little bit deeper and look at the nuances across racial neighborhoods that might have a similar racial makeup. So we looked at the Pittsburgh equity indicators, which I think came out in 2017. St. Louis came out in 2018. Again, other reports that you might want to take a look at, and figured out what do we mean by equitable distribution, and came up with a series of 10 indicators which go beyond race, diversity, and income, and really look at, are we equitably distributed by age? Are we equitably distributed by the kind of real estate that's on the ground? Are we equitably distributed to how we engage with neighborhoods? And we use the idea of the neighborhood plan as a proxy of engagement, and then looking at life expectancy and crime. I won't kind of tell you the results in this presentation about every single one of them. I'll tell you the ones that kind of became the important ones. But we basically ran through a series of analyses of 6 years worth of CIP allocations. So every CIP allocation is a 6-year budget in itself. And so we're looking at 6-year budgets over 6 years and looked at how things were being allocated on 3-year averages. And so we came up with basically for every 3-year rolling average of the capital budget, how much per capita was being spent across different categories of neighborhoods. So neighborhoods that are above 92% African-American to those that are less than 32. And this is based on looking at quartiles of neighborhoods. And so you can see that in the original 3-year rolling average of the capital budget, neighborhoods that were more than 92% African-American were only getting less than half the per capita spending. But the good news is that as the CIP budget has progressed, we can see actually now it's more equal, a little bit higher, but basically more equal. So that's a way to think about how do you want to look at equity over time. So this was clearly an inequitable distribution by race, but has kind of gotten better. And we converted every one of these tables into a graphic, so you could look at it. If everything were equitably distributed, the CIP would look at these quintiles worth of categories of neighborhoods. Every one of them would get 25% of the budget. And you can see basically graphically that it was pretty inequitable in the beginning and a little bit more equitable now. But this becomes what Chris is talking about, having those conversations like, is this equitable? We haven't undone some of the egregious kind of lack of investment from the past. We've just made everything a little bit more equal. But really, shouldn't it be about overcoming some of the lack of investment from the past? So having those conversations is difficult. And thinking about what is the solution for something like that in the future becomes an interagency massive conversation, because this is all agencies CIP for the city of Baltimore, and getting DPW in the room and Rec and Parks in the room and transportation in the room to think about this has been a challenge. So the city actually did the analysis for the next year for the CIP FY 2021, and actually it started trending in the negative direction again, which is ironic because they're actually trying to track it, but it's going in the wrong direction. The one thing that I do want to point out is for neighborhoods that had a plan in place. So neighborhoods that have a plan that is kind of old, prior to 2010, more recent plans, 2017 to 2018, you could see that the more recent your plan was, the more likely your neighborhood had a shot of getting into the CIP, which makes sense because you're having conversations about what your neighborhood wants to see in their neighborhood. And so that your CIP and your agencies are going into neighborhoods where the community actually wants that investment. And so actually one of the inequitable distributions is actually just neighborhoods that don't have a plan. There's no way for them to even get into the CIP process. And that's one of the findings that we saw through this analysis. So all of this, I will just say, this is a very, very quick overview of the project, but it's all available online. There's an interactive map if you or anyone else, and obviously it was meant for communities in Baltimore to see. We have a 2-page kind of infographic if anybody wants to take a look at it, and I will put this in the chat when I'm done. But this is just one aspect of what is going on in neighborhoods, right? This idea of capital investment, which is such a critical part of economic development, right? If you're not investing in the bones of your neighborhoods, you're not going to actually grow anything else. But I did want to point to a group that did a lot of research in Baltimore and in actually cities across the world called the Center for Urban Research on Austerity, because, and this is an interesting title, Governing the Perma Austerity in Baltimore, because that's literally what we've been facing. We have been in austerity measures with respect to our budget since probably the 1970s. And so we're constantly thinking in terms of reducing your budget and reducing revenues. We've probably had a little bit of uptake back in 2010, but it's kind of come right back down. And obviously COVID-19 is making things worse. And so what's nice about this research, if you want to take a look at it, is the mindset of budgeting constantly in austerity and some of the things that cities around the world have had to do. Obviously, the Greek cities come into play here. They were literally in austerity measures. And Baltimore shares a lot of the common kind of themes across cities around the world. and one of the things that I found was interesting from this research that we participated in on behalf of Baltimore was that if you're in austerity mode with your budget, equity seems like, maybe something that is too rich for you to deal with, right? You're in survival mode. So if you're just trying to survive, what does equity have to do with it? But obviously in some cases, the equities could be, inequality might be killing your ability to survive or grow or actually come out of austerity. And that you might find some cities that have actually focused on equity that led to kind of less austere budgets. And so the story that a city tells about what the priorities are with respect to spending is so critical. And that's what one of the key findings that I found interesting from this research is that you have to tell a story about what your city is trying to do with its budget. And so if equity is a part of that story, not only do you say it, but your budget's got to do it. And all your agencies come in line through that. But you have to have leadership that says an excellent story about what it is that you're trying to achieve with your budget to come out of a situation, especially if you're in austere measures. So I'll just stop there for now.
Well, Seema, I really appreciate that. And in fact, the detail and how we go from the theory that Christopher talked about to how you might begin to think and operationalize it, I think is really why I enjoy these particular conversations. So we're going to open up for further discussion now. I've had several folks chat me some questions, so I'm going to start with those. If you have other ones, feel free to pop it in there. It's sometimes hard not to talk over everybody, so happy to do that. If you want recognized, either hit the raise the hand button or wave at me, and I'll kind of tee the crew up there. But maybe, Seema and Christopher, you could start with this one, which is, you talked a little bit about ways to analyze information. Are there other either tools or software or other things that you're using right now that kind of help you make that happen and make that dance?
So we actually, this was hard work, actually doing the analysis of our CIP budget. Yep. One, because the CIP itself was a mess in terms of the data in there, but then also thinking about how to push it through this kind of neighborhood lens. It is like a little bit of sausage making. But we actually were just in a conversation with the Urban Institute, and they came out with an equity analysis tool, and they are providing some training, and I'll put that tool in the chat too. But it's actually an amazing tool that you can put in any data set from your city, and they have preloaded some of the indicators like income and race and I think age was in there. Not all of the ones that we did, but they preloaded for the entire country. So if you wanted to just look at your your jurisdiction, I recommend taking a look at that, and I'll put the link in there too. But that seems like to be the next step, that you want to constantly be doing this, right? You don't want to do this once, like Christopher said, you need to do this all the time. And so if the analysis is a struggle to do or difficult to do, that's going to preclude you from doing it very often. And so the Urban Institute's tool is something I think a lot of cities are using, but should be used more.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I would also say that, Seema's work is especially valuable because it's producing a tool that can be used for that. I'd say the tools that we use are pretty diverse, from, various state and local administrative data sets to, census data, as well as federal data sets that can be, detailed at the state and local level. I also think, I talked a little bit about some of the ways that it's easier for us to do this analysis because we're, having a perspective is part of who we are. But one advantage if you're doing equity analysis from within a state agency or for a legislative body is you can have access to really detailed administrative data if you actually have access to it, and our, agencies are communicating with each other that can, allow much more detailed analysis.
I appreciate both those examples, and thanks for sharing in the chat. I really like the next question that came in the chat here, and then Jason, I'm going to come to you right after this next one. So you're on deck for that one. And our friend from Puerto Rico, is it Adero, I think, asked a question about austerity, right sizing in government space. And maybe from my perspective, because I get to vote on budgets on a regular basis, I sort of view the equity question as, even if I'm only spending $1, I should think about that dollar through a lens of equity, just as I think about it through the lens of, is it parks, is it pavement, et cetera. So it's almost as if no matter how much I'm spending, this should be a part of it. I don't know, Christopher and Seema, if you have any thoughts on that, and then Jason, I'll turn to you after that.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'll jump in
I
there.
thought you might.
So yes, absolutely. At some point, the city of Baltimore has got to, right size itself. We've lost 1/3 of our population in the last 60 years. We were 950,000 people, and now God only knows what we're going to get from the 2020 census. We all think it's going to be below 600,000. So we are bleeding people to the point where, it's actually really impacting our ability to do anything. But we are the only East Coast, that was true of all the East Coast cities, right? New York was bleeding people. Philadelphia was bleeding people. Washington, D.C. was bleeding people for a long time. But every single one of those other cities that are along I-95 has turned themselves around, right? Washington, D.C. is now a growing city. New York is growing. Boston is growing. Philadelphia is growing. Newark, New Jersey gained population in the last decade, and Baltimore is the only one on the East Coast that is not. And so we've got to figure out what we're doing wrong on this East Coast corridor. We are in the megalopolis region of the United States. More than 1/3 of the population lives between Washington and Boston, and all of our sister cities are gaining population and we're not. So we've got to do some real soul searching that, okay, we can right size, but we're clearly doing something really wrong if we're not even with our sister cities in their ability to grow. So we do have to think about growing. That's not to say that that's going to be the ultimate answer. We have to grow, though, and actually figure out what it is that, because otherwise, we're just going to keep bleeding, and we are the hole in the donut for the region, and nobody's going to survive if the city doesn't survive. So yes, I've heard the argument about right sizing, but we are not Detroit. We're in a much, much better locational advantage than a Cleveland, which might have to think about really right sizing. So Baltimore's got to do some soul searching on that.
Yeah, I would definitely echo a lot of Seema's comments. I would also say, so, right, absolutely, even if you are in an austerity or quote unquote right-sizing situation, thinking about the equity implications of how you spend each dollar is important. And, looking at that neighborhood breakdown that we saw of capital improvements is a good example of that. It's also important, I think, to analyze the impacts of, again, not just how the pie is sliced, but the size of the pie itself, possibly including, decisions that you might not have control over. So a city council, might be able to say, look, we're allocating X billion dollars as well as we can, but because of, changes to the tax base or policies at the state level, that are often inequitable or discriminatory, those are affecting equity as well. And that can be, part of an advocacy strategy for a local government to actually show what the impacts of state policy are.
I appreciate those comments very much. Jason.
Hi, I'm in the District of Columbia government. And so Chris's comment about racial equity impact analyses struck a chord with me because the DC Council just created an Office of Racial Equality or Racial Equity that is going to do racial impact statements that will, in addition to the fiscal impact statements that are already done. And this new office is doing a lot of really good work. It's just a few weeks old. It's looks like it's doing really good work. But one of the things I wonder about is that I can see a possibly problematic impact that bills come out of our committees. And so now then they go to the budget office that does the fiscal impact, and they'll also get the racial equity impact from this new office, which is all good. It may bring a lot of good information to the forefront. But the possible negative is when committees are doing their bills, they should be looking at equity as one of the policy things that just underlies their legislation. So they look at, equity, feasibility, whether something meets a high profile objective. So I sort of feel like committees should always be doing this interwoven in their analysis, and certainly they can get help from this new office in doing it better. But sort of parceling it out could have a negative impact, because I think they will say, well, the racial equity component, that's their responsibility. So I'm just kind of interested in how this all plays out. And when you look at fiscal analysis, that has a lot of uncertainty and room for error, but it does have that common denominator of dollars that maybe makes it a little more feasible. So I just wanted to throw that out because the whole issue of the impact statements is very interesting.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd say putting equity impact analyses on legislation isn't necessarily the final step or the be all and end all, but is an important first step and establishes the norm that equity is one of the things that, as a rule, gets looked at. And I think also that it can have an incentivizing function. If you're, many times I've been working with legislators on developing a bill, and everyone is very sensitive to how is this or that provision going to affect the fiscal note. So we don't want to have a bad fiscal note or it's going to kill the bill. So I think that there is an incentivizing function of now that that equity analysis is going to come out, we better hope that we put this together in a way that it's going to look okay. And so if that is then actually based in fact, then trying to make it look okay then can, hopefully lead to creating bills that actually do promote or not hinder equity.
Thanks for sharing that. I will have to look into that new office. It sounds really interesting. But to me, it's all about process. So if there is an inequitable finding, then what? Is the bill dead, or is it that there's a way to kind of address it? Or, thinking about process is going to be so important for that, but also hopefully some nuance. And actually we give two data points that are pretty easy to understand, because we are, again, a majority minority city. So race alone is just not telling us anything. So we look at life expectancy. And if you look citywide, life expectancy for white population is something like 79 years. And for African Americans, it's 76. So we have a racial gap of 3 years between white and Black, which is a true gap. But we took two neighborhoods that are both 93% African American, Howard Park on the west side, for those of you that are familiar with Baltimore, and Clifton Berea, which is on the east side. And they're both 93% African American, and there's a 10-year life expectancy gap between them. And so even though we have a racial divide, we have a bigger spatial divide. And we did the same thing for two neighborhoods in the city that are 65% white. One is Guilford, which is one of our wealthiest neighborhoods, and one is Morrill Park, which is in the southwest side of the city. They're both 65% white, and they also have a 10-year life expectancy gap. And so race is one component of it, but we have such spatial gaps in the nature of the quality of life by the neighborhood itself. And that gets to a deeper conversation about what are we trying to achieve here? So there's different tools for the toolbox for Howard Park than there are for Clifton Berea. Clifton Berea, is 66-year life expectancy, and Howard Park is like 76. And they're both 93% African American. And so the data hopefully gets to a deeper conversation about the inequalities, right? There's spatial inequality, there's racial inequality, there's all kinds of different inequalities, and how do we get to the kind of heart at all of them?
So, Seema, I think that's a great point, because it's not just about one level of equality and inequality. And I think that just really highlights that space. It's also a great point for me to plug that next month's monthly musing will be about AI. And if you think about the role of AI and flagging those things and how it's applied in budgeting, maybe there's a lot of opportunity in that particular space. I'm going to go to Dan Williams next, and then there's something in the chat for Seema and Christopher to pick up on if you want to take a look at that in the chat after Dan goes.
I apologize for no video. I have a problem with my camera. I teach people to solve small local problems and in a big city. And most of this has been talking about jurisdiction-wide equity issues. And I'm looking for ways to work equity into smaller proposals that still might affect equity. And I'm wondering if there's any feedback on how to deal with that.
Could you repeat the last part, how to deal with?
Well, for example, New York City's budget is around $95 billion, and my students aren't going to learn to deal with $3 to $5 billion proposals. They're going to learn how to deal with, well, I require them to make proposals of at least 250,000. I did have one person who got up to $1 billion, but that was very, well, actually she did it wrong. It wasn't really $1 billion, but you know, we're talking about something that affects a neighborhood, a school district. We have community districts, and it might affect a community district, and that's where they're going to be. They're going to be talking 500,000, often 2 million, 3 million, which is a small impact on the city. Looking at equity of the city doesn't make any sense in these. I'm looking for how to work an equity concept into a small local project.
So when you might want to take a look at our CIP analysis, because what we did, CIP covers a lot of things, and different capital improvements have different levels of influence on either a neighborhood or the city. So we actually categorized all of the CIP into things that have a very localized impact. Like if you improve a playground, it's really just for that, you know, literally block or neighborhood. But if you improve the regional library, that's about, you know, has a broader influence in the southeast side of the city because it's a southeast anchor library. But then if you also, and then we had citywide things that have, you know, treating the wastewater treatment facility was for the whole city. And so we actually did a categorization. And what you might think about doing is, you know, if you want your students to look at the things that have a small radius of influence, like the playgrounds, like the, you know, something like that. Our report kind of gives examples of what those might be, and, you know, analyze the playgrounds. Where are we providing, where is a budget for rehabilitation or reinvestment in playgrounds in the city? And even though the cost is what it is, it's really about targeted influence of how that might affect a neighborhood. That might be one idea.
Okay, thank you.
So I really like Steve's flag to the executive order on equity over there. You know, I don't know, Seema or Christopher, you have a comment on there. You know, for my colleagues who are in the federal government who are on this call, I can tell you that many of us in the region, in particular at the Council of Governments, are having direct conversations on what equity means to each of our jurisdictions. And I think there's a great opportunity to share that. I know in every meeting I'm at, and Jason, please tell hello, Councilmember Mary Che, hello. She and I are on a committee together, the Farm Committee, looking at food and agriculture in our region. And so that opportunity, I think, really exists to look at what does equity mean when it comes to farmers markets and how that may apply for USDA funding going forward. And so there's a lot of that thinking going on from that particular space. And so I wonder, Steve, if I might spin your question a little bit and think about maybe us as cities or states as sort of laboratories for the nation. You know, are there some best practices or ideas that are happening at the locality level, even the multi-jurisdictional nature of localities that might be elevated for that particular space? I think of the Farm Committee as one where it's you know, multiple jurisdictions. I think, and don't quote me on this, I think there's 9 or 11 of us in the COG region who are trying to figure out what are each of our policies doing and how do they line up? And is there a nugget there that should be replicated? I know we applied for a USDA grant in a partnership with George Mason University on hyperlocal composting and what that may do. Because right now we compost in the city of Fairfax. We actually send it to Maryland to do it, right? And you sort of ask yourself, what the heck is that all about? Like, if I'm composting in the city and I got to drive to another state to actually process it, isn't there a little breakdown in that? And what's the equity impact on that particular space to allow folks to do table to farm and farm to table? So I really like that question, Steve, you asked, and maybe that example of the laboratories or experience. I don't know, Christopher, if Seema, if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think it's really for obviously inside the classroom, you have to be that tactical because there's only so much you can do in a semester. But even as a city agency, you might just start testing these things out. So I'm all for it. We're actually encouraging our own planning department, you know, even if you don't do a full CIP analysis, which they are going to do on an annual basis, you could take anything that you're trying to do and kind of push it through this lens and just see what you see. You know, don't be afraid to see what you find, right?
Steve, I saw you come on camera, so happy to give the floor to you for a second to see if I got that quote right there or anything to add.
Yeah, I put in the chat there. I used to write environmental impact statements for the federal government. So the structure of the bureaucracy is there to expand it to include or emphasize other aspects of the quote human environment. That's what it says in the law, human environments, which actually it does include the socioeconomic, but nobody knows that. They think it's all about birds and trees and stuff like that. Anyway, so for instance, the third bridge that they're proposing over the Chesapeake Bay, they're going to getting ready to release an environmental impact statement. That's the type of thing where you can say, hey, the president wants to do more equity emphasis on before we make a decision on whether to put in the third bridge, because people on the other side of the bridge are like, whoa, hold it. This is definitely going to affect us on the other side. And so that's an example of how before a project is decided, even though maybe that's already been decided, you know what I mean? I understand. But at least theoretically, the idea of having eyes wide open, not just on the physical environment, but on the social and economic environment, which are the three parts of quality of life. So thanks.
Appreciate that very much. I really like the idea of what lessons can we learn from locals and how it shares up. So that's going to definitely be something I take back and begin thinking about. And I get excited when I see executive orders tied to actions I'm taking at city council. That connected community space is something I really enjoy thinking about. So you definitely have got my attention there. I think we have time for one more question. If not, I'm going to plug again next month's space with the AI experience. And I know we're going to get a date out probably end of this week as to when that actual date will be. And as always, we just got a question in the chat. I feel like it's part of the doing the public funding drive on NPR. So we've made our last question call out there. So very excited there. I'll let Seema and Christopher take a peek at that and see if either of you have a comment you'd like to build on.
Christopher, it's for you, by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was this regarding the question in the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, Christopher. I was trying to give you cover to read it so you could read it and then respond to it without me having to read it out loud. Sorry about that.
I apologize. No, I was reading it as you were speaking. So the question is, what sources you could use to establish priorities in terms of equity needs to compare it against funds allocation. So, you know, that's something that can, you know, have a subjective element to it because it's, you know, what is the right level of funding for any given level of need. An example of that could be, you know, looking at, so we've been, education funding is one of our main focuses. And so in Maryland, we actually did a large increase in education funding from about 2002 to 2008. And then with the Great Recession, we almost completely reversed that by 2015. And so, what we saw was not in terms of raw dollars, but then, when you adjust that for students' needs, by 2008, almost all school districts, regardless of, racial or ethnic or economic makeup, were roughly adequately funded by the state standard. But by the time we got down to 2015, not only were about 3/4 of districts substantially underfunded, 15% or more below that standard, but we saw that more than half of Black students in the state were going to school in a district that was underfunded by 15% or more, compared to, in 2015, only about 8% of white students going to a school in a district that was underfunded at that level. So, that would be a way of showing that, once you adjust for needs and, compare that the need has not gone down over that time, the funding overall has decreased and has decreased in an inequitable way. And the context of that was partly, contrasting that way of looking at it versus how the pie is sliced. So, if you simply look at, public schools as a share of the budget is remaining constant throughout that time, well, we're doing the best with what we can. But, when you look at the trends and compare it to the needs, rather than just how the pie is sliced, you see that, even with a stable allocation, you're falling short of growing or stable needs.
Thank you. I was just interested because Seema said that in their projects, they had integrated the community view on equity. The neighborhoods will develop their plans and it will be the voice of the community. So I was curious if at the level of the policy analysis of tax and revenues, we have already integrated this quality component of people's voices, but we still, I guess, operate on the level of numbers. The needs are established in dollar amount and we just compare the allocation. Thank you.
Right, yeah, and certainly, the quantitative analysis is often the easiest to do because you just, you go online, you download the data, you analyze it. And, I think there are definitely things that provides you information-wise that's the only way to get. But, something that I didn't really get into is it is absolutely important when you're looking at equity to actually get in touch with directly affected communities to make sure that your analysis is actually rooted in what people on the ground are experiencing and caring about. So thank you for bringing our attention.
Oh, thank you.
Well, we are at the top of the hour. I know many of you probably have a 1 p.m. because in Zoom land, everything goes back to back and there are no breaks to be human. So I recognize how that is. I think, yeah, Dr. Kuntz is going to stop the recording here so we can capture it all. Thank you all for joining today. Again, next month will be about AI in budgeting. And I'll just close with this comment. I'm a big music person. My brother's in the arts. And if you didn't have the opportunity to look at the musical selection for the inauguration, I found it very telling that the music that was playing when Amanda Gorin took the stage was a piece called The Integrity Fanfare in March by Julie Guiraud from the work No Finer Calling. I do believe that all the arts were speaking to us on Wednesday to pay attention to the words of a 22-year-old. So I listen to it often and am inspired for the future. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.